I remember many times as a kid hearing my dad tell the story about when he was a Baptist pastor. I was 6 months old. There were 5 of us siblings. Oldest was 12 years old. And God began to deal with my dad. He was pastoring a little Baptist church. And he was going into the county seat of the county that little town was in and doing services in the county jail. And he had such a burden and passion for guys who were in jail and guys who were alcoholics. And he felt like God said to him, start a rescue mission in this town of 20,000 people. And he was wrestling with it. He has a family to support. No visible means of how would you finance this. And I've heard him tell the story how one night in a dream, God showed him, as he would describe it, like a coffee table that would go in front of a sofa. And he said in that dream, that table literally had money just stacked up all over the top of it and literally running down on all the sides around the table. And God said to him, I'll take care of it if you'll do it. And my dad said that night, he told God, okay, I'll do it. Interestingly, at 6 months old, I had serious pneumonia. And immediately, I started getting better. My dad resigned his Baptist church, went to the bank, and when he closed out his bank account in that little town, the teller slid 3 pennies to him because that was how much was left after the account was cleared. 5 little kids. He did have contacts in the town. There were 2 twin brothers that in those days were known in small town as the town drunks. And those were his connection to the city. But a lot of people knew them, and they were watching the impact he was having on those lives. So they said, we want you to meet someone. And they took him and introduced him to Mrs. Frensley, who became the very first person who gave financially to support the rescue mission. Still interesting to me because it's hard for me to believe it'll be 70 years this February that my dad started that mission. Still go back to the little town, took Grace back there, and there's the old brick building that he rented, 2-story building. For many years you could still see the faded sign of the rescue mission on the side. But God was faithful. Began to supply finances, resources. And in about a 5-year period, built a brand new building, debt-free, still there, still functioning, long after my dad's gone to be with Jesus. But he dared to dream God's dream for that city and for that ministry. My parents were distance runners. Never had a lot of money, but they were always faithful to God. Interesting, at the same time that God asked him to do this mission with no visible means of support, God also put in he and my mom's heart that instead of them just tithing, they were to give 20% of their income directly back. And the whole time my dad lived, and even after he passed away, when my mother was on Social Security, she still gave 20% of whatever she had. And you know, it's interesting, they always had enough. They always managed to have what they needed to operate. God took care of them. This series, we're talking about distance runners. Our theme verse is Philippians 1:6, being confident of this very thing, that he who has begun a good work in you will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. I want to talk to you today about dreaming God's dreams. Did you ever daydream? I remember when I was a little kid, I frequently was stuck at my dad's rescue mission because he, for some reason, thought somebody ought to be there, and there's nothing like having a 6-year-old receptionist at the church. And I always remember Knott's Grocery was just a couple of, less than a block away. And any of you remember those little grocery stores in small towns? And I still remember the pop machine. It was one of those where the bottles of pop were on this little rack, and then they hung down, and they had refrigerated water that kept them cold. And the nice thing about that is when you pulled it out, then you got nice dripping water from the pop. But there's nothing like a grape-it soda that comes out of one of those machines. And I think they were called Milo cups. Remember those? You old enough to remember those? I was one day out behind my dad's rescue mission, and there was an area that had just been kind of sloped down from when it had been built to raise the level to be even with the front of the building. And I was laying out on that little bank just looking up at the clouds. Have you ever just looked at the clouds and you start to see things in the clouds? And then you begin to daydream. Man, there were things I dreamed about, of things I was going to do, what I was going to accomplish. But do you realize that dreaming didn't originate with us? It originated with God. And that frequently the dreams that he puts in us, both the literal ones that happen when you're sleeping and the dreams that he puts in your imagination, are dreams that he wants to fulfill. And I know of no one better to talk about this today than Joseph. Here Joseph was, Jacob's son. If you remember Jacob's story, Jacob was the one who fell in love with Laban's daughter, Rachel, and man, he wanted to marry her. And he said to him, well, son, work for me 7 years and you can marry my daughter. He should have asked for more detail. Have you ever kind of walked off with half information and thought you knew what you really knew and you didn't? So wedding night comes. He gets married. And of course, full cover from the wedding garb. And all of a sudden, he's in the bed and he freaks out. Because it ain't Rachel, it's her sister Leah. I always love how the King James puts things. It says she was weak-eyed. Or in today's terms, she had a good personality. Ain't much to look at. I know we're not supposed to say things like that. This isn't woke appropriate, but I'm telling you, she was dog ugly. But he's married to her, and Laban kind of was half truthful because she was also his daughter. He says, not a problem. He says, work for me 7 years and you'll have Rachel. So man, he was so in love, he did that. Now he had sisters for wives. You want to talk about a messed up Arkansas family. Well, I shouldn't say that. Some of you may be from Arkansas. But the truth is, it had to be complicated. And if that wasn't bad enough, the whole value in that culture for women was being able to have kids. And so Leah began to have kids like clockwork. Every year she's pregnant again. And Rachel can't have any children. So finally, God hears Rachel's cries and gives her a son, Joseph. And Joseph became his dad's favorite. He gave him a really nice Corvette. Whatever Joseph wanted, he got. he was Dad's favorite because Rachel was his favorite. I'm going to tell you, that had to have been a very dysfunctional home. And the older brothers didn't like their little brother. And they did not like to see him coming, but he's Dad's favorite. So if Dad needed to communicate to them, because one reason you had kids in those days was it immediately became your labor force. And they did not have a Children's Workers Union of America. If you were a child, you worked for your parents and you got paid maybe, and maybe you didn't. So Jacob wanted to find out how his boys are doing. And he sends Joseph. Joseph, the kid who also probably had developed some issues with being the favorite child. And he was a dreamer. And he had these dreams. And he basically would tell his brothers about them. And the gist of the dreams was this: I'm going to be in charge, and you're going to bow down to me. Well, that will really help relationships a lot, won't it? And so he was in a tough place. And his dad finally said, I want you to go and check on your brothers. And that's where we pick up in Genesis 37, verse 12. Brothers had gone off to Shechem, where they were pasturing their father's flocks. Israel said to Joseph, your brothers are with flocks in Shechem. Come, I want to send you to them. Joseph said, I'm ready. He said, go and see how your brothers and the flocks are doing and bring me back a report. He sent him off from the valley of Hebron to Shechem. A man met him as he was wandering through the fields and asked him, what are you looking for? Trying to find my brothers. Have any idea where they are grazing their flocks? The man said, they've left here, but I overheard them say, let's go to Dothan. So Joseph took off, tracked his brothers down, and found them in Dothan. They spotted him off in the distance. By the time he got to them, they had cooked up a plot to kill him. The brothers were saying, here comes the dreamer. Let's kill him, throw him into one of those old cisterns. We can say that a vicious animal ate him up. We'll see what his dreams amount to. Dreamer, not necessarily tempered with great wisdom yet. And now brothers who are not real godly in how they live, who are angry with their dad, angry with their brother, and they decide we can solve the problem. Easy. Because we'll just tell Dad that he got attacked by a wild animal and was killed. His oldest brother, Reuben, somehow had something in him that had this sense of godliness. Because he said to them, he says, hey, we really shouldn't kill him. Let's don't actually kill him. What we can do is we can still tell our dad he died, but let's sell him into slavery. And so that's exactly what happened. So here you have Joseph, the kid who's always had privilege, kid who's always gotten things his way. Now he's been sold to a band of slave traders. So slave traders means they're going to sell him to someone else. But his dreams were so real to him. You and I live in a war zone. You can't ever forget that. Ever since Adam and Eve sinned in the Garden of Eden, sin's been turned loose in this world. And the world has been at war between good and evil, between God and Satan. And because Adam and Eve chose to sell out to Satan, they basically died spiritually. And their existence then came from a mind and emotions and body operating without the spark plug of the Spirit to connect them to God. So they were just out there. And that's how all of us were born into this world. And through Jesus, the bridge has been made so that now we can be back in relationship with God. we now have the ability to be back in touch with God. But the moment you sign into God's kingdom, you become a direct enemy of Satan. And he's going to attack. And I think there's so many people that God would do amazing things through. And dreams he puts in our hearts that the enemy robbed. I was with somebody this week and they reminded me of an old song that I hadn't thought about in a long time. I went to the enemy's camp and took back what he stole from me. Any of you old enough to remember that? Yeah. And I tell you, it's time we take some dreams back. And the story of Joseph tells us how to do it. And I want us to look at that this morning. It's important to identify dreams that are based on supernatural revelation. There are also dreams that are because you ate too much pizza. And I don't know about you, but I dream a lot. And they're dreams where I'm processing things that are going on in my life. And they're dreams that try to still unpack things that happened to me years ago. It was so funny, not too long ago, I dreamed a dream and Pastor Betzer was firing me. And I woke up and I realized, number one, he's retired. Number two, he would have never fired me. And number three, I don't work for him. So why did I sweat so much in the dream? Many of you had those kind of dreams that are just so real, and yet they're not reality. But then there's those dreams that you know there's something significant. And it's important to be able to sort out what is a dream that is tied to supernatural revelation. The book of Numbers, verse 12, or chapter 12, verse 6, God says this himself about dreams. Hear now my words. If there's a prophet among you, I, the Lord, will make myself known to him in a vision, and I will speak to him in a dream. God has specifically said, I speak through dreams. And I believe that when we look at that, it is dreams that you have when you're asleep, but I also believe it's dreams that begin to come into your spirit that we would process through our mind, and they come in those things like I was talking about that time when I was looking at the sky and the clouds and daydreaming about what could be. Some of those things that we talk about as daydreams are actually God dreaming into our lives the things he wants to do in and through us. So what are we open to be? Who are we open to let God make us into? What are we going to allow God to do in us? It's important that you do this, that you separate the supernatural from just routine natural dreams. One of the things that I've learned to do is if there's something that seems to have significance, you need to vet the dream. Have you ever done something where you didn't properly vet whatever it was that you were doing? Have you ever been an employer and somebody just made a good impression on you on their interview? My old boss Betzer used to say that resumes are the best fiction ever written. You better not just look at a resume if you don't vet it, because it may not all be true. And it's important that you and I vet the things that we begin to feel. Maybe there's something bigger than me in this. Maybe there is something that's spiritually connected. It's important that you learn how to separate and really determine, is this something supernatural? Is this something God's doing? Is it something he's connected to? And then to also learn how, because there's times, it's just like in the dreams in Joseph's story, both his dreams, the dreams of the baker and the cupbearer, and the dreams of Pharaoh, there was symbolism. You know, in Pharaoh's dreams, he saw these cows. And what did that mean? Well, Joseph understood how to interpret the symbolism, so he said to him, here's what those mean. The 7 fat cows are 7 years that are going to be amazing for harvest. And the 7 skinny cows that eat the fat cows are going to be the years that are going to come behind that are going to be a time of great famine. So it wasn't really a dream about cows, it was a dream about years. And it's important when there are things, because this frequently happens, when we begin to have God try to show us things, He seemingly shows us in ways that can be symbolic, and then we need to be able to sort out and understand and interpret correctly what is it that God is saying to us. We don't want to be like the guy who decided he needed a word from God. So he opened his Bible and he said, God, show me what I'm to do, and I'll just put my finger on the page I opened to a verse, and then I'll do what it says. So he opened his Bible. The first verse he opened to, he put there, and it said, and Judas went and hung himself. He thought, oh my goodness. So he opened it to another page in the Bible and did the same thing, and that verse said, go and do thou likewise. Got to be careful. Got to make sure that what you're hearing is what God's saying. And then also this, don't try to manipulate whatever you've heard to make it happen. Let God be the driver of fulfilling the dreams. You know, one of the things that is a valuable part of being a part of a Spirit-filled church is we believe that if it happened in the New Testament, it can still happen today. So we believe that spiritual gifts are very much alive. If you look at what is referred to in the Ephesians that we understand as the offices of ministry within the church, when you look at the different giftings that are listed in Romans, and then when we look at the manifestation gifts in 1 Corinthians, all those are important. And in those manifestation gifts, there's both prophecy and there's also tongues and interpretation, which gives us words from God, and then tied into that are words of knowledge. It's information that you couldn't know unless God told it to you, and then words of wisdom, which is now that you have the information, what are you going to do about it? And all of those are ways God speaks to us. And it's interesting because through the years in Pentecostal charismatic circles, there's been a tendency to almost put a false sense of value in a word spoken. That if you had somebody give you a word, then that meant it's going to happen. Well, number one, the Bible says test the spirit of the prophets. I'm going to tell you one of the things that we don't sometimes talk enough about. There's a thin line between soul and spirit. God does everything He does in us through His Spirit speaking to our spirit. But our soul is so closely attached to the Spirit that frequently our soul is what we get motivated by, and our soul is what begins to try to sort out. So this is what the Spirit is really saying to me. And the Word of God, it says, is quick and powerful. It's sharp, more sharp than a two-edged sword. It divides the soul and spirit. And it's important that you understand this. A person who operates in prophetic giftings better understand what I'm saying right now, or they shouldn't operate in them. A person who operates in gifts can get out of the spirit into their own soul if they're not careful. Be careful if you move in the gifts that you know that it is the Spirit, and that in the excitement of the emotion attached to that, you don't take it beyond. I've watched this over and over again, where there'll be a word from the Spirit, and the person that's giving it gets excited, and they begin to feel like they see it, and they begin to expound more than just what the word was, and they get in trouble if they begin to go into their soul. Does this make any sense? And that's why it's important if someone gives you a word that you make sure that you don't just run with it. Here's something to know. If you are given a word, it either is going to confirm something that has already been spoken to you, or there will be confirmation that will come. Don't do anything until you at least have confirmation of 2 or 3 witnesses. Don't run with things that haven't been confirmed. And make sure, because sometimes in it being explained, you're going to get more clarity from having multiple understandings of what it is God's saying to you. And that's what's so wonderful about God. He wants us to clearly understand. He doesn't want us to go off half-cocked. And that's why it's so important when it comes to dreams. If it begins to happen, I frequently have said through the years to people, put it on a shelf and let God take it off. And when I say put it on a shelf, I don't mean ignore it, don't value it, but don't you try to implement what God needs to be the one to implement. Make yourself available to be His instrument, but don't try to do it yourself. And that's where people get in trouble with dreams, is they begin to try to fulfill them. They begin to manipulate them. And you need to wait to hear and know this is God and He's making it happen. And this ties right into what I want to talk to you now. Championing and guarding supernatural dreams simultaneously at the same time. Back to Genesis 37. This is Joseph now. Told it to his father and brothers, his dreams he had had. This was now the second time. Now his father reprimanded him. He had probably caught all kinds of flack from the brothers. What's with all this dreaming? Am I and your mother and your brothers all supposed to bow down to you? Now his brothers were really jealous. Here's what's interesting, but his father brooded over the whole business. You know why his father brooded? His father knew it was God. He just didn't know what to do about it. Because you got to remember, he's one who had kind of done things his own way. Remember Jacob's the one who stole the blessing from his brother Esau. You want to talk about a manipulator? He's the one who got manipulated and got stuck with Leah. He's the one who had been through a lot of things, and now he's seeing this come from his son Joseph, who he loves, and he knows God has his hand on him, but he also doesn't understand what does this mean that he now sees himself because Joseph hasn't yet learned humility. There's a thin line between confidence and arrogance. You need to have confidence in whatever God does in your life. But be careful that you don't become arrogant. Because arrogance then becomes about you, not about God. Confidence means I'm trusting God and He's going to do this through me. And so when there are dreams, it's important that you champion them. And Jacob did that. He was brooding on that. But it's important to remember this. Exercise caution in both timing and with whom you share the dream. I promise you, for every dream you'll ever have, there are 10 dream killers. And here's what it is. A lot of people haven't done what they could have done, and they're disappointed in their own lives, and then they're angry that somebody else, or they're hurt that somebody else is pulling off what they haven't done. And they'll try to pull you down. Don't let them rob your dream. But also remember this, you don't share it with just everybody. I love in Luke where it says that Mary kept and pondered all these things in her heart. Mary was somewhere between the age of 12 and 14 when Jesus was born. I want you to think about this. It's part of that culture. Now, can you imagine what would have happened if people were coming over to see the new baby? And they walk in the door and she says, "Be careful, this is the Son of God. I've given birth to him. By the way, I'm a virgin." A lot of people would go, "This is a very delusional, psychotic child." But God gave Mary wisdom that people weren't going to understand what He had done in her. And as a result, don't just tell everybody. When it's time for people to know, God will tell them. Keep doing what you're supposed to do without announcing something you hope will happen. So important to learn from this. It's what Joseph had to learn, and part of what took him down a tough road was because he couldn't stand it. He had to tell his brothers, this is what's going to be. I'm sure they had ridiculed him. I'm sure that his brothers had just tormented him because they were older than him and they were Leah's sons, and they resented the fact that their Aunt Rachel was the mother and she was the favorite and he was the favorite. It was just pretty difficult. And it's so important to ponder and process what is the significance and meaning of what God's doing. And don't tell just anybody. Ask God, if you want to talk to somebody about it, to tell you who to share it with. And if you're like me, I'm an external processor. Probably one of the best things Grace and I learned that has helped our marriage be strong is the difference in how we both process. Whatever is going on with me, I need to talk it out loud. And if I'm not careful, I'll talk it to anybody who'll listen. Because I'm processing. And you just happen to be the person instead of a fence post who got to hear what I'm processing. Grace will sit on it for 12 years before she'll tell you what it is. Maybe not quite that long. Because she's an internal processor. But I'm going to tell you something. When she does open up, I listen. Because it means it's been thoroughly vetted. She's ready for it. What she had to learn with me, I used to make her panic because I'd start talking about all these different things of what could be and what we would do. And there was usually dollar signs attached. And in her mind, I'm spending thousands of dollars we don't have. I'm not spending a penny because it doesn't cost anything to talk about it. But we had to learn that. And it's important that you learn who it's okay to process with and who you don't. What are the things you hold close and let God unpack? That you let God do. I remember years ago when I got a promotion. My boss didn't tell anybody for a year. I had the promotion, but nobody but me and the boss knew it. I'll never forget the day that I came out of his office when he told me he was going to go public with it, and his secretary, he had just told her, and she said, "How long have you known this?" I said, "For a year," and just walked off. Because she was one of those real busybody kind of people who wanted to know everything. But I was smart enough to know she didn't like me. And she would have undermined me if I'd told her. It's important that you learn wisdom in how you process things, because you can create your own problems. And that's exactly what Joseph did. His brothers did bad stuff, but he didn't help his case by telling them. He would have been far better off to have never mentioned to them, this is what's going on. And yet, don't we have an amazing God that through all that web of just a mess, God still delivered the family and the world. And that's what's important to remember, is that we can thrive through what seems to be an unorthodox reality path for the supernatural dream. Because sometimes how it gets from what this dream was to what it really is, and how cows turn into years, only God can do. But he takes it through. Years have now gone by. Joseph's been through all this journey that he went through. And his brothers are standing in front of him and they don't know who he is. The brothers who sold him into slavery. All these years later, all they know is they're standing in front of the prime minister of Egypt. The only person who has more power in the whole world in those days was Pharaoh. Joseph was second to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh did what Joseph told him. So he was really the most powerful man living at that time. And they know that their family is having a hard time because of the famine. So they've literally come all the way to Egypt just to try to get food. And they're in front of this guy. And he puts them through the ringer. You can't tell me he didn't enjoy this just a little bit. All the things they had done to him when he was a kid, and the ultimate of selling him into slavery. And now they're standing in front of him. And he wants to see, has anything happened to improve their hearts? See, he had another little brother named Benjamin. And when Benjamin was born, their mother had died in childbirth. And Benjamin was a precious child to their father because he had lost Joseph. He thought Joseph was dead. So he was hanging on to Benjamin. So again, being who he was, he kept Benjamin at home, sent the rest of the boys that were Leah boys, and told them, get us food. And so Joseph, of course, knows everything, but they don't know he knows anything. So he just casually asked that kind of good old boy question. So, you got any other brothers? Well, we do have one little brother at home with his dad. Well, I want to meet him. Bring him to me, and then I'll give you food. Oh, we can't do that. We had a brother that we lost, and our dad's grieved so much for him that he couldn't handle it. He's old now, and if he lost his other boy by that mom, that would just be so bad. Well, you want food or not? They go back, they show up, and of course we know how he sets them up. There the cup is that he makes sure it appears that Benjamin stole because he wants to see their heart. And he says, he's going to have to go to prison. We found this cup that he stole. The old days, the brothers would have said, well, Benjamin, sorry. But Judah says, put me as a slave instead. The rich heritage in the Word of God, because Judah was a descendant, or rather David would descend from him. And Jesus himself would come out of the lineage. And so Judah, God's beginning to stir in him that spirit of redemption. He says, keep me, don't keep my little brother. It had to have been tearing Joseph up by now because now he's seeing their hearts. He's realized it's not what they say. So finally it comes down in chapter 45, verse 4. Come closer to me, Joseph said to his brothers. They came closer. I am Joseph, your brother whom you sold into Egypt. Two of the biggest shocks that ever had to happen was the day that Joseph was announced as the prime minister of Egypt, because there was a guy who went home that day and said to his wife, oh, this is the worst day of our lives. And Gertrude said, what? He says, you remember that boy that you told me was hitting on you and I got him put in prison? He's now the prime minister of Egypt. She's going, what? And then Joseph. You mean this guy that we're trying to get food from is the brother we sold into slavery and we're so mean to? You want to talk about some guys who had some body function issues for a minute. Wow. God sent me here ahead of you to save lives. There's been a famine in the land now for 2 years. The famine will continue for 5 more years, neither plowing nor harvesting. Here again, understanding dreams. God sent me on ahead to pave the way and make sure there was a remnant in the land to save your lives in an amazing act of deliverance. So you see, it wasn't you who sent me here, but God. He set me in place as a father to Pharaoh, put me in charge of his personal affairs, and made me ruler of all Egypt. Wow. What's gotten in the way of what you thought was going to happen in your life? What has it feel like decimated whatever you had hoped for? Could I remind you that God works in mysterious ways His wonders to perform? How could it be? Can you imagine Joseph with the dreams he had had, and all of a sudden he's been thrown in the back of some wagon with his hands and feet bound and sold to slavery and going to be taken to Egypt, totally away from every comfort he's ever had? They didn't even let him take his iPhone. It's in the book of Hesitations. But basically, how does that fulfill the dream? Well, you see, the problem was the dream couldn't be realized if he had stayed back in Canaan. Because Canaan wasn't where the answer for the famine was going to come from. It was going to come from the mega capital of the world and the greatest economy of the day, Egypt. So God had to get him to Egypt. And God knew how hard it was going to be to get there flying airlines. So God put him in the back of a slave trader's wagon. Sold into slavery. Now, here's another thing that we sometimes get challenged, especially as charismatic Christians. He gets there, he gets sold into Potiphar's house, but he's good. And Potiphar quickly figures that out, and Potiphar begins to put him in charge of everything. He's got everything going. Everything's going great till Potiphar's wife gets the hots for him. And it would have been easy for him to say, well, you know, God's blessed me. So here I've been through all this. This must be the dream. I'm living the dream. I'm the head slave. There are a lot of us who still live in bondage to things of darkness because we misinterpret the blessings of God and we don't recognize there's more God has that we haven't yet seen. We haven't yet experienced. God wants to take us beyond where we're at. And we get caught up with some kind of a pseudo dream of what it could be instead of recognizing God has something more. He really was allowing Joseph to go through this because not only did he have to get to Egypt by the slave, but he wasn't going to get to Pharaoh's palace unless he met the right people with the right connections, and those people were going to be in prison. So now, can you imagine what it was like when he said, man, I thought everything was going great, and now all of a sudden I'm in prison. Have you ever been where it felt like things were going so good in your life, and all of a sudden you start getting diagnoses from the doctor, you start having reversals in your finance, you start having problems in relationships, and you're going, wait a minute, but I'm a Spirit-filled believer. Why is all this junk happening within my life? Why am I being thrown in prison? Well, God's not finished yet. He's not going to leave you in prison. He's going to get you out. And it is in prison, of all places, where he's going to meet the person who's going to introduce him to Pharaoh. Because remember, the baker and the cupbearer for Pharaoh both got put in prison. And what did they have? Dreams they didn't understand. And Joseph has begun to know fully how to hear from God. So he tells them what their dreams are. It didn't make the baker very happy because he basically said, you're going to die. But to the cupbearer, he says, you're going to get back in your place. You're going to be restored. When you get there, would you remember me? Sure will. Months go by, probably years. Cupbearer doesn't remember. And there's times when you feel like God showed you things, and then time, even decades, can go by and you're going, why did it never happen? Why am I where I'm at? Why have I gone through what I've gone through? Why have I not experienced what I thought I was going to experience? God's timing is always perfect. Had the cupbearer immediately introduced him to Pharaoh, Pharaoh would have said, who's he? It had to come at the moment where Pharaoh has a dream he can't understand. And all of a sudden the cupbearer goes, wait a minute. I remember when I was in prison, that guy named Joseph, Joe knows how to interpret dreams. I'm going to look really good with Pharaoh. And he brings Joseph in. Now all of a sudden, here's the moment. And he tells Pharaoh, this is what your dream means. And Pharaoh looks at him and says, if you're smart enough to know that, then you got to be smart enough to implement it. And it's going to take somebody really smart to make this happen. You're in charge. Wow. From slavery to false accusation to prison to the palace to in charge. Now all of a sudden, the dream he had as a kid starting to make sense. And then the day that we started out reading about, where his brothers are standing in front of him, the minute they walked through the door, don't you know he was just busting to say to them, do you remember the dream? Because he did. And here it was, all these years later, being fulfilled. And God used him so that what opportunity released and what was possible now became probable and reality. God's faithful. He implements the supernatural dreams that he has for us in the fullness of his time. Genesis 46, verse 3. Now Jacob's an old man. His sons have come home and said, you're not going to believe this, but Joseph is alive. Furthermore, you're not going to believe this, but he's in charge of everything. And he wants you to come to Egypt and live. And Jacob's wrestling with what to do. And God speaks to him. He said, I am the God of your father. Don't be afraid of going down to Egypt. I'm going to make you a great nation there. I'll go with you down to Egypt. I'll also bring you back here. And when you die, Joseph will be with you. In his own hand, he'll close your eyes. Wow. What seemed impossible. God always makes past injustices right. Has anybody ever done you wrong? Are there people who've intentionally harmed you? Have you become bitter? Or have you become better? Have you let it go? Have you left it in God's hands to work out? Have you manipulated your own revenge? Or have you trusted into God's hands, however it's going to need to be resolved? And when we let it go to God, when we allow him to truly be God, and we just let ourselves be in his hands, it's amazing what he works out. It's amazing what is accomplished. All things are made right. God has a way of bringing everything exactly where it needs to be. What is it that's gone wrong in your world that you still grieve over? Let it go. God's got you. God will reveal, and in his time, he'll put his stamp of approval on the dream. I love this saying, you worry about God's reputation, and he'll take care of yours. Don't try to defend yourself. Leave that to God. There's going to be a point that you begin to realize the dream is bigger than the path that's taking you to it, and it's even bigger the present moment when it's being fulfilled. Isn't this interesting? And this is the amazing thing of God. He says to Jacob, go there. Jacob's going, but wait a minute, you told my dad to come here. This is the land of promise. God says to him, yeah, but I'm going to in Egypt turn you into a major nation. And then I'll bring you back. God knew exactly what he was doing. He already knew about Moses. He already knew that when they came back, they would end up having a king. And he knew David was going to rule the people. And he knew that through David, Jesus was going to be sent to redeem what Adam and Eve had done in the garden. That was all a part of Joseph's dream. It was bigger than just him going and being in charge of the world under Pharaoh. It was about out of him would come someone who wasn't in charge under the world. It would be someone who would be put in charge who's over the world. That's why 400 years passed and there was a Pharaoh who knew not who Joseph was. Because the bigger dream was redemption of everyone through Christ. But it's part of the dream. Your dream isn't just about you. Your dream is about God's purposes and plans that are bigger than you, that are bigger than this moment, that God's fulfilling for a part of the whole eternal picture of what he's going to do. So what do? Let go of control while you lean into the full potential of whatever God wants to do in you. What does it look like? I don't know. God told Abraham way back in Ur, I want you to go to a place that when you get there, I'll show you where it is. That's trust, isn't it? What's the dream? And what have you done with it? Are you still willing to believe God? Are you still willing to let him do something bigger than you can do in the natural? And make yourself available for whatever he wants to accomplish? It's exactly what God wants to do. And the impact of the dreams are bigger than what we can think. My dad went to that small town. The thing that, this is kind of funny, the town that he was pastoring in when I was born is Loco, Oklahoma. Some of you may be real surprised to know I came from Loco. Some of you go, now it's all making sense. Little town of Loco, Oklahoma, to the big county seat of Duncan, 20,000 people, for a rescue mission. What's the impact of that? A few years ago, my son-in-law Aaron called me one day. He says, you're not going to believe this. That time he was working for a coffee company right after he and Cecily and the kids moved to Dallas. He says, there's a woman in my office, and we were just talking. We've been working together for a while. I think she was the office manager. He says, we've been working together for a while, and somehow I mentioned that my father-in-law grew up in Duncan, Oklahoma. And he said, she said, Duncan? That's where I grew up. What's your father-in-law's name? He said, well, Campbell. His dad ran a rescue mission there. You mean Brother Campbell? When I was a little girl, my grandma was a single woman raising me and my siblings. And Brother Campbell used to make sure we had food. Used to pick me up every Sunday and take me to church. Now, isn't it a little random that in a city the size of Dallas and all the suburbs around it, that my son-in-law, who grew up in Michigan and was living there all these years later, would happen to work with a woman who, as a little girl, was raised in the little town of Duncan, Oklahoma, and somehow out of millions of people, God connected them because he wanted me to realize dreams are bigger than us. And the impact goes far beyond what you and I can ever measure. Don't underestimate what God can do and how it's going to impact far beyond what you ever see. My dad was long gone from this side of glory before I even knew that story. My mom didn't even know it. It's been since she passed. But what it did was remind me, God's dreams are amazing. I pray that LifeBridge Church becomes a church of people who dare to dream God's dreams. I'm so excited when I see these kids going back to school, because I believe in our kids there are people who are going to go far beyond what any of us could think about or imagine. I think of you, Jared, what you're doing with Destiny Rescue. And then I look at little Liam and what Espy prophesied over him when she was here. We don't know the full potential of what's going on down in the hallway in our neighborhood, what God's going to raise up. The opportunities God's given right now that I'll be talking to you more and more about. At a time when a couple of years ago I thought, well, maybe I'm slowing down a little bit. Dear Lord, what was I thinking? Now this whole thing with Indiana, Michigan, Chicago. And God's called this church as a prototype for other churches. It isn't just me that he's doing this to. Welcome on board the dream. And God's going to do some amazing things through us that's going to impact this world. This October, get ready. God-sized visions. What's yours? Father, help us to see it. Help us to realize that you have amazing things that we can't see. But the dreams that maybe seem squashed, seem hopeless, seem impossible, they're still you. If you have to go through us being in bondage, if we have to go through times that we think we figured it out and it's a pseudo dream, feels like we've been in prison, God, help us to know that all that is an unorthodox path that you're using to the palace, your kingdom purposes. Let us live it in Jesus' mighty name. Maybe you've walked in today, you don't know Jesus. I want to pray a simple prayer. If you're online, pray this prayer with me right now. In the room, everyone pray it as affirmation. Say, Jesus, come into my heart. Be my Savior. Forgive my sins. Give me eternal life. I receive you now. Amen.